I want to say it this way, and this is not an understatement at all. This is not an underestimation. In fact, I don't know that I can say it strongly enough. God used the Greek Empire to set the cultural stage of the rapid expansion of the gospel. So one question we have to ask is, how is it that the gospel exploded throughout the world? Every one of these empires played a role. So the Assyrians, the Babylonians after them, the Persians after them, and the Greeks, and then eventually the Romans, they all played a role in the expansion of the gospel. No one played a more of an important role than the Greeks. So the Greeks and their culture set the stage for when Jesus is crucified, buried, resurrected, and the New Testament gospel witness starts to be written and be preached. It is the Greek culture that allows for the fast expansion of the gospel. Had it not been for the Greeks, through the sovereignty of God, we would not have seen what we saw in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries, the explosion of the gospel all over the Roman Empire. So let's talk about it a little bit. Geography and location. The geography is very similar to the geography of the Persian Empire. That's at its height, and that's because the Greeks did not really conquer land, they conquered an empire. So they conquered the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great defeated the Persian emperor and just kind of took over all the area that he was already controlling. That was the extent of their empire. We talked about in our last session how the Persian Empire was the largest of the ancient empires. The Greek Empire was only that size for a very, very small time, and then other parts started breaking off and they kind of lost control of all of it. And we'll get into some of the reasons why a little later. But you have a map there of the Greek Empire, and then inset in the bottom right-hand side, you have the map from the Persian Empire. If you look, it's identical territory. It's the same exact territory, and Alexander the Great even never expanded it beyond what the Persians had. It started in modern-day Greece, in Macedonia, what we call Macedonia, and so it started in that area, but it expanded out of modern-day Greece and came to have the same imprint for a short time as the Persian Empire. The historical importance. So we've got to go back to the Persian Empire. There are 2 invasions. The Persians tried to invade Greece twice, and neither time was really that successful. The first time was a disaster, and that was under Darius, and Darius was a very successful emperor, but he just failed trying to invade Persia. And so when we think about the Battle of Marathon, that's when Darius tried to invade, and it just didn't work out. He tried a sea invasion. So the Persians were not necessarily great sailors, but they contracted some sailors and got some ships built, and they were going to invade Greece. They go in, it just doesn't go well. They come back, and Darius says, I'll come back to fight another day. Well, he doesn't get the opportunity to do that, but his son Xerxes does. And so that's when we talked about last session with the story of Esther. That window between the time that the emperor of Persia banishes his queen and the time when he chooses a new queen, that time period, that gap there, is because he's in Greece, he is invading Greece. So the second round, 10 years later, so the first one takes place in 490, the second one takes place in 480. When he invades the second time, when Xerxes invades, that's when we have some of these other famous battles, the most famous being the Battle of Thermopylae, and that's where if you've ever heard of the movie 300, I've never watched the movie. I've heard there's a lot of nudity and violence in it, so I've not watched it. But you know the general story of it, that a small group of Spartans held off this massive army of Persians. Now, there are exaggerations on both sides, and you've got to remember the Greeks are the ones writing the history on all of this. The Persians didn't write any of this down. The Greeks wrote this down, so you've got to remember a little bit of hometown bias is coming into play when we hear about this. So that's where we get 300 Spartans held off 1.2 million Persians. It probably was much more than 300 Spartans, and it was probably a lot less than 1.2 million Persians. But when you're writing the story for the folks back home, exaggerating a little bit for the hometown team always helps out your cause. And so that's the story that gets told and gets passed down to us. So the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians actually won. They eventually get through. They come into Greece. They do invade Greece. It's just not successful. They have a really hard time doing it. They're never really able to hold on to it. But one important thing that happens is most of the invasion takes place in the southern part. The northern part, where a city called Macedonia is, they actually become a vassal state of Persia, so Persia doesn't need to invade them. They say, hey, we'll pay tribute, we'll be part of the Persian Empire, no need to fight against us. So you have places like Sparta and Athens, these cities that are historically strong. They spend a lot of their time and energy fighting off the Persians. The Persians eventually kind of succeed. They do enough to get a political victory that they can go back home and say, well, the great and mighty Xerxes has invaded and has subdued the Greeks, and there is no internet, there's no social media, so whatever you spin at home probably gets believed by most of the people, so he gets what he needs and he heads back home. The Greeks, however, really are never fully subdued. So Persia takes a second strategy. Persia decides, and this is brilliant, the Persians were great at politics. They said, instead of invading Greece, what we're going to do is we're going to fund, for a while, Athens. And we'll say, Athens, we really want you to be the rulers of Greece. So we'll give you some money, we'll help you put your army together, and you go take on those Spartans. Well, then after a little while, they'd go to the Spartans. They'd say, aren't you tired of Athens really just having all the best stuff? Why don't we fund you for a little? No strings attached. We'll just fund you for a little while. Here's a little bit of money. Go build up your army. Why don't you go take out those Athenians? So by keeping them divided and fighting against each other, they kept them from unifying and being a real threat to the empire. Again, all this happens in the southern kingdoms. Macedonia is left alone. Athens is fighting Sparta. Sparta is fighting Athens, back and forth. They won't unify. They try to unify at different times with different groups. It just never works out. Again, because the Persians continue coming in and kind of stirring the pot up and saying, well, if you'll side with this group over here, we'll give you a little more money. And so that's what they do. Brilliant strategy, and it works. It's effective. For over 100 years, it's effective. But then in the north, Macedonia is able to grow in strength, and eventually a ruler comes to the throne in Macedonia called Philip II, and we know him as Philip the Great. So Philip the Great decides, you know what, I'm going to unify everybody. Sparta is weak, Athens is weak, Macedonia is strong, we've not been ravaged by war, so he waits for a moment of weakness. He unifies everybody and says, you can be with me or you can be against me, but I've got everybody on our side. You're weak, you don't have much of an army right now, so follow me, and we're going to go invade Persia. So that's what Philip decides to do. And just before he's going to invade Persia, already has his plans in place. In 336 AD, he's assassinated. Now, who he is assassinated by is a source of great mystery. So it's possible that he was assassinated by one of his bodyguards. Who was behind it is the bigger question. So we know about that in our nation. So we know Lee Harvey Oswald pulled the trigger. Maybe there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll, but at least Lee Harvey Oswald pulled the trigger. Well, who trained him? Who funded him? Who set him up? Did he act by himself? Was it the Russians? Was it the Cubans? Was it the CIA? Was it the aliens? All kind of theories out there. Same thing with Philip the Great. So it possibly could have been his son, Alexander. His son Alexander, and there's one ancient writer who says it was Alexander and Alexander's mother who actually had him killed. Alexander wanted the throne. Alexander was 20 years old, about time for him to get the old man out of the way and become the ruler, and so they had him assassinated. They paid the bodyguard. Nobody knows because the bodyguard got caught and stabbed to death before he could tell anybody anything. And so that's what happened to the bodyguard. But others, and I think this is really interesting, if you see a threat in the north, and we already know how the Persians have controlled Greece to this point, some people think the Persians paid to have him assassinated. Whatever, if the Persians did it, it was a bad move. Because with Philip out of the way, Philip was a great leader, Philip was a great organizer, but Philip was nowhere near as ambitious and as talented as his son Alexander was. So the army's already put together, the coalition's already made, everything is already in line, the money's already there, and Alexander, at 20 years old, steps into the leadership role of the Greek Empire. And Alexander has it out for the Persians. Alexander is out to prove, and so there's this great moment where he steps foot into Asia and he claims Asia for Greece. Now you can look at the map. Greece is very small. Asia is massive. And Alexander steps foot on it and says, I'm here and I am now, Asia now belongs to Greece. And so that's just the kind of guy that Alexander was. We're going to take the whole empire. he was not all talk. He had the ability to back it up. So in the decades that followed, or in the years that followed Alexander coming to the throne, he defeats Darius, which is Darius III, not Darius the Great, in two subsequent battles, 333 AD and 331 AD or BC. And when you read about those battles, Darius really did not have the stomach for the battlefield. He was not a great statistician, but he also didn't have the stomach for the battlefield. So when things got hot, he would run. In both of the battles, just when you're kind of at the turning point of the battle and it looks like Alexander's gotten the upper hand, Darius says, I'm out of here. He runs. He leaves his soldiers in the way that he exits, in the way that the Persian battle line would be set up. He left his soldiers exposed. He takes the middle out. So if you've ever seen an ancient battlefield, one of the things you always try to do is break the middle of the line. Well, when Darius retreats, he has all the best fighters who are in the middle of the line retreat with him to protect him. It leaves both of the flanks exposed and they're destroyed. So that happens in one battle. He goes around and says, hey, I need some more soldiers. So the vassals say, we'll give you some more soldiers. It happens in the second battle, and Darius can no longer put together an army. Both of these, very important, happen in open field battles. So this is not a siege. There's no need for Alexander the Great to go down and lay siege to one of the Persian capitals and trap Darius inside. Basically, the Persian Empire says to Darius, we will no longer follow you. But you know who seems like a really good ruler? Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great says, why don't you just become part of the Greek Empire? And so the Greeks take over. Alexander the Great becomes the ruler of the Persian Empire, except now it's the Greek Empire, and Alexander the Great rules. The only problem with Alexander the Great is that he did not live very long. So he died at age 33 in the year 323, so less than 10 years after he takes control of the entire empire. And nobody, especially rulers, nobody anticipates dying at 33 years old. And so at 33 years old, when he dies, he does not have a plan of succession in place. So because there's no plan of succession in place, the empire is divided up into four main areas, and then as the years go on, it's divided more and more and more. And so there's really no continuous Greek empire very long after the death of Alexander. A couple things more I want to say about Alexander. Very important things. First of all, he is credited with inventing ice cream. So we all have that to thank for Alexander the Great. He was up in the northern part of Persia, up in the northern part of Iran, up in the mountains. He got some snow and he said, it'd be really great if this snow tasted good, and somebody created ice cream. So we can all thank Alexander the Great for that. But the second thing, to think about his death at 33 and what all he had accomplished at 33. He conquered the entire world. But then to think about how his empire fell apart after him. I can't help but think of Jesus. Now, we don't know how old Jesus was when he died. Contrary to popular opinion, the Bible does not actually tell us he was 33 years old when he died. It tells us he was around 30 when he started his ministry, and we can count some events in the Gospels that tell us his ministry was about 3 years. So we don't know if he was 33 or not, but he was somewhere within the 33 age range. And so to think about these two leaders who lived the way they lived, Alexander the Great, the height of power, leading an empire, conquering armies, whole 9 yards, and to watch within a few years of his death all of that fall apart, and to see Jesus, who dies with all of his followers scattered, with no kingdom, no empire, having written nothing, owning no land and no position, and then to see how the world is still impacted by Jesus and his leadership today. It's a really incredible study of leadership. And of course, Jesus knew he was going to die, and Jesus did have a succession plan in place. His empire did not splinter. His empire exploded in growth after he died and after he went to heaven. So that's Alexander the Great. I want to talk a little bit about the Greek culture because it's extremely important for what we want to see and as its impact in the Bible. The Greek army was well known for the phalanx. The Persian army did not fare well against it. So the Persian army, we talked about it in last session, they relied on shooting a lot of arrows having a cavalry drive in, and then a ton of foot soldiers, light infantry that could move really fast. Well, the Greek phalanx was, oh, you've probably seen it. It's like a turtle. It's like a turtle that has spears and swords coming out of it. And it moves across the battlefield together. So arrows really don't have much of an impact on it. You can shoot 100,000 arrows a minute, as the Persians did, and it's just going to hit the Greek swords. It's going to fall off, and they're going to continue advancing. As you're shooting arrows, they're able to advance. Well, that does a couple of things. First, it doesn't take out their army, and secondly, it keeps your cavalry from really getting up speed. You got to shoot all those arrows, and you're expecting the enemy to sit there and kind of wait, and when the arrows are done, here comes the cavalry. Well, they're advancing the entire time, and the Persian army really didn't know what to do about this when they encountered it. And it's interesting to me that over 100 years they encountered this, and they never really found a way to kind of crack the code. So they encountered it at Marathon, and it went horribly for them, but over 100 years later, they still couldn't defeat it, even on their own battlefields. But as it would advance, and even as the cavalry would come against it, the phalanx had a giant long spear sticking out of the front of it. And you have support from multiple men behind the front line who are all working together. So there's a lot of coordination, there's a lot of planning, a lot of practice, and they would have practice. The local city-states would have practice. Everybody show up today for war practice, and they would practice how to do this. And so if you ride a bunch of cavalry into those spears, you're not going to have the impact, you're not going to be effective. And then if you send light infantry in after that, when your soldiers are facing light infantry with light armor, and you're facing soldiers who have really strong spears and really strong armor, then you're just not going to fare well. So this is how they were able to conquer the Persian Empire so quickly and so effectively. And then they conquered the world with their culture. Now here is what the Greek culture, the lasting contribution that the Greek culture made to the world. They Hellenized the world. You've probably heard that word before. They Hellenized the world. And that's the Greek word for Greece, is the word Hellas. So they Hellenized the world. This includes the Greek language. So the Greek language became the first universal language. We cannot overestimate the importance of this. English is the world's universal language right now. It's the trade language. If you're going to do business, you probably need to know English no matter where you're from. Greek was the first trade language. Before that, no language had ever unified the Mediterranean and ancient Near East world, but Greek did. So it's the first time we had a unified language. Then there was the Greek culture. There were baths, public bathhouses, gymnasiums, theaters. We typically think of these things as Roman things, but they're not. They're Greek things. The Romans did what Americans are really good at doing. We find a good idea and we Americanize it. That's what the Romans did. The Romans took all the Greek ideas and they said, why would we reinvent the wheel? Sounds good to us. Let's use this as part of our culture. Greek democratic ideas. Again, the Roman Senate came from the Greek Senate. So they, up until Rome became a dictatorship under Julius Caesar, they operated very similar to the way that the Greek democratic society worked. Greek architecture. You'll notice the Romans did not change much. There's a slight difference from Greek architecture to Roman architecture, but the Romans pretty much said, this looks good to us, we'll keep that style of architecture. And then the Greek pantheon of gods. If you've ever studied the mythology and the Roman gods and the Greek gods, you'll notice that there is a Roman god for every Greek god. Again, the Romans just said, sounds like a good idea to us. We'll take on all these gods. We'll rename them. We'll give them Latin names. So they usually have a Latin name and a Greek name. So the Romans did not propagate Roman culture. They just adopted Greek culture. Now here's why that's so important. So important for what we're here to talk about. That unified the world around one culture. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. The entire world of the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East is now unified. Not only the Romans will unify it under one empire and they'll make their own contributions, but they are now unified under one culture. If you're going to have a cultural movement like the gospel, then you need a fairly unified and uniform culture to do it. So God is at work throughout history, the assassination of Philip, the ascension of Alexander the Great, the cowardice of Darius III. All these things that are happening because God is at work bringing the kingdom of Jesus Christ to earth. So that brings us to biblical significance. Now, one thing you will not read about in your Old Testament or your New Testament is the Greek Empire. The Old Testament closes under the Persian Empire. The New Testament opens under the Roman Empire. So the Greek Empire is in the intertestamental period. However, there are books that are intertestamental books. They're not part of Scripture, they're not inspired by God, but they do tell us the story of the Jewish people between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're called intertestamental books. So we have this book called First Maccabees. First Maccabees gives us basically a summary. I'm not going to read it, but gives us a summary of everything that we've just said. I've put it there in your listening guide for you so you can see. It summarizes, everything we've just been talking about. It's not in the Bible because of the time period when it happened. So God sends the last prophet in Malachi and the next prophet in John the Baptist, and Malachi is serving when the Persian Empire is in control, and Malachi, or John the Baptist, comes to be whenever the Romans are in control. So it's in that what we call the intertestamental period. However, that does not mean that the Greek Empire does not have a massive influence on the New Testament. So when we think about Hanukkah, that happened not under the Greek Empire, but under the remnants of the Greek Empire. And so the question, comes, is Hanukkah in the New Testament? It actually is. Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. So the Gospel of John records for us that Jesus went to Jerusalem as a part of the Festival of Lights. That's Hanukkah. So he went and celebrated Hanukkah. Those things happened under the remnants of the Greek Empire. It's so important for us to understand that before the New Testament was written, the whole world spoke Greek. So if you're Jewish and you were spread out all over the world, why were they spread out all over the world? Remember the Assyrians? The Assyrians came in, conquered northern Israel, spread them out all over the world. Remember the Babylonians? They came in, conquered the southern kingdom, brought some of them to Babylon. Well, when the Jews returned, the northern kingdoms were still scattered. The southern kingdoms, not all of them returned, many of them stayed in Babylon. So you have Jews spread out all over, for the first time, spread out all over the Mediterranean world. And so they're all over the Mediterranean world, and their language that they speak and understand is Greek. It's not Hebrew, it's not Aramaic. So if you're going to reach people, if you're going to teach people your religious heritage, you've got to translate the Old Testament. So beginning about 250 years before Jesus was born, they started translating the Old Testament into Greek. It's what we commonly refer to as the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is a Greek version of the Old Testament. It is the predominant way that Jewish people, at the time of Jesus, were reading and understanding the Old Testament. It is almost exclusively the version of the Old Testament that the New Testament authors quote. So when they say, the prophet Isaiah says, or Deuteronomy says, or this book says, or that book says, they are almost always quoting the Septuagint. They're not actually quoting what we call the Masoretic text, the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. And there are little nuanced differences along the way. So if you listen to a sermon and you're reading your Bible and you go, wait a second, that word's the same, but it's a synonym, but it's not the same as what's in my Bible. You know that the preacher is preaching out of a different version than yours. It's not inaccurate, it's just a different version. Well, we can tell that from the New Testament too. When we study the New Testament, they are quoting the Septuagint. So it's hard, even if we just stopped right there, the influence of the Greek culture is massive on the New Testament. Because our New Testament authors, Matthew, Mark, John, James, when they quote the Old Testament, they are almost always quoting the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, and not the Hebrew version of it. Then we, of course, know the New Testament was written in Greek. So the entire New Testament, when God chose the language to put the gospel in, He put it in Greek. Jesus did not teach in Greek. He taught in Aramaic. He spoke Aramaic. But when it came time to write the information down, it was written down in Greek. And then Gentiles, sometimes we talk about Jew and Gentile. In the New Testament, if you'll notice, sometimes Gentiles are just simply referred to as Greeks. So it helps us see how the Jewish people saw the world. They saw the world as Jews and Greeks. Those were the two divisions, Jew and Gentile. Greek was synonymous with Gentile for them. So we think about Romans 1:14. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and to the Greek. So that includes everyone. When you say the Jew and the Greek, that includes everyone. That was the way that the Jewish people thought. And then Greek thought dominated the Roman world. So when you think about the world of the Bible, especially the world of the New Testament, you need to think about two different locations. Think about Jerusalem and everything that happens around Jerusalem. So that little small area, and then think about everything else. So think about the rest of the Mediterranean world. In that area around Jerusalem, Hebrew and Aramaic were spoken. When you get outside of that, Greek is really the language that ties it all together. And so when you think about this, what you have are two different worlds. You have the Jewish world. That is more of an ancient Eastern way of thinking. That's more connected to how the Persians would have thought and the Egyptians would have thought, and that Eastern way of thinking, which is very different than our way of thinking. The Greek way of thinking is a very Western thought. It's very similar to us. It's very time-oriented. So you ever been reading the Old Testament and you get frustrated because you can't figure out the timeline? Now, why don't they just tell us when this happened? And they don't tell us when this happened. What do they tell us? They tell us in the 4th year in the reign of King Hezekiah. So for them, it's all about relationships. But they will go chapters and chapters and chapters without giving us any time references. And it drives us crazy. How long was it between the flood and the Tower of Babel? We have no idea. Not a clue. Now, if we were writing it because we're Western-minded, the very first thing we would say is here's the date of when the flood happened. And when it's our job, say it was your job to write about the story of the Tower of Babel, the very first thing you'd put is the date. It drives us crazy that there are no dates, that very rarely do they give us dates. It also drives us crazy that they are continually telling us who begat who. You're like, why does it matter who begat who? I want to know when this stuff happened. That is a Western way of thinking. Time is very important to us. We are very time-oriented. Eastern people are very relationally oriented. So relationships are much more important to Eastern-minded people than time. And so as we say, why don't you just tell me what time has happened and get all these begats out of the way? They say, why would you not want to know who begat who? This is really important stuff. You need to know that this guy is the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of this guy. That's really important, and you know what it is. And shame on us for not seeing that is really, really important. So that's the Eastern mind. The Western mind is very logical, ordered in its thinking. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And so when you think about the Greek world that produced some of the mathematics that we still rely on today, and some of the architecture and some of the thought processes and democracy, it's very ordered. It makes a lot of sense to us. That doesn't mean it's right or better than the Eastern world. You just see these two worldviews kind of clashing with one another and then also coming together in the New Testament. So when you're reading your New Testaments, for the most part, here's what you're reading. You are reading people who think like Eastern-minded people, but they write with a language that is a Western language. So the Greek language is a Western language, but their thought process is Eastern in their thinking. Let me give you an example. Compare the book of James with the book of Romans. Try to outline, just do this sometimes, try to outline the book of James. Good luck with that. What is point 1, point 2, what is sub point 2, whatever. Then try to outline the book of Romans. The book of Romans reads like a lawyer's argument from front to back. He anticipates the next question and answers it. That is a Western way of thinking. And James talks about a subject, talks about another subject, talks about another subject. Then he circles back and talks about all three of those subjects again. Then he circles back and talks about all three of those subjects again. That is a very Eastern way of thinking. So for the most part, when you're reading your Bibles, your New Testaments, you're reading Eastern thinking people who are writing with a Western language. Now this is extremely important as we're reading our New Testaments, because we will get lost if we try to force Western way of thinking on Eastern-minded people as we're reading. But it becomes important for us as we think through the power of the gospel to deal with both of these. So here's Paul. Here's what Paul says. Paul says, the Jews demand signs. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 22 through 25. The Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles or to the Greeks. So let me tell you what he's saying there. He's saying to the Jews, when you say your Messiah has come, what happened to him? He was crucified. That's a stumbling block to the Jews because they say God would never allow the Messiah to be crucified. So Jesus cannot be the Messiah. When you say to the Greeks, tell me about this Messiah, and you say there's this Messiah, and he was crucified, they say that sounds foolish. We're looking for a powerful ruler. We're looking for, if he's really sent from God, he's going to be a powerful ruler who ascends to the throne. That's foolishness. So it's weakness to the Jews. It is folly to the Greeks. But then he says, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Paul is a rare individual, not just in the New Testament, but in all of history. One of the most brilliant people to ever exist. He could think, speak, and write in an Eastern frame of mind, and he could think, speak, and write in a Western frame of mind. And he does it quite often as you're reading your New Testament. In fact, he tells us that. He tells us, to the Jews I became a Jew, to those under the law I became as one under the law, to those who are outside of the law I became as one outside of the law in order that I might win them. So when I'm speaking to Gentiles, I speak with an Eastern way of thinking, and you can see this in his preaching in the book of Acts. When he's speaking to Jews, he takes one approach. When he is speaking to on Mars Hill, for example, or when he is he is preaching in Macedonia, he takes a very different approach in his preaching. And so he's one of the few people who's able to operate in both worlds. Now, the author of Hebrews is almost exclusively in the Eastern mindset, in the Western mindset. So much so that people have accused him of mimicking Plato, which he absolutely does not. He's drawing those ideas from the Old Testament, not from Plato, but many people have accused him of basically plagiarizing Plato, which he has not done. But anyway, as you see the differences in Paul and the author of Hebrews, those kind of come to light. So many of the New Testament letters were written to Greek cities. So Corinth, Colossae, those cities that just come to mind over and over again, Thessaloniki. So those letters are written to Greek cities. And then after the New Testament, this is something even beyond the New Testament that still to this day has a huge impact on the way that the Christian gospel advances. After the New Testament was written, it was already happening in the New Testament, but after the New Testament was written, there became two centers of power in the Christian world, or two centers of influence, we should say. The city of Rome, we're familiar with that. Vatican is there today, so we know that there is even though we're not Catholics and we don't buy into the Pope in Rome and that kind of thing, we know that Rome is an important city for Christianity. And historically speaking, a lot of the big decisions made in the early church were made in Rome. Peter went there and served there, which is one of the reasons why Rome became so connected with Christian theology, and a lot of the influence of Christianity was centered around Rome. The other city that we don't think nearly as much about is Antioch. Who's connected with Antioch? Paul. That was Paul's sending church. So Paul's connected with Antioch. After the New Testament, because of the influence of Peter and Paul, those two cities continue to grow in power and grow in influence in the Christian world. And Rome becomes the center of Western Christianity, and Antioch becomes the center of Eastern Christianity. And so those two continue together. Latin is spoken in Rome, and that's more the Western thought, Western Christianity. Antioch is more Eastern thought, Greek, center of Eastern Christianity. So when we talk about the Eastern Orthodox Church, we trace that back to Antioch. When we talk about the Western Church, we trace that back to Rome and other cities as well. But still to this day, right now we're watching all this unfold in Ukraine. The Orthodox Church in Ukraine and the Orthodox Church in Russia, those trace their roots back to that movement that came out of Antioch. So even beyond the New Testament. And Alexandria, because the Greeks founded this city of Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. And it became a center of of academia, both for the Jews and for the Christians that followed. And a lot of the early theologians came out of Alexandria, and there was a center of culture there. So even beyond, well beyond. And think about this, Alexander the Great, he's only there for 10 years or so after he takes over the empire. But that influence, God using him for that short amount of time, an ambitious and overly ambitious, brilliant battlefield strategist, takes over the Persian Empire for a very short 10-year period of time, and God uses all of that to set the stage so that when the gospel comes, it can explode and it can spread like wildfire across all cultures because they are all united under the same Greek culture. And He gifts a guy like Paul. Paul, who was not born in Jerusalem, who was born outside of Jerusalem, knew how to think like a Greek because he was born in the Greek-speaking world, but then he is educated in Jerusalem, and so he's educated under one of the most brilliant theologians of the day, if you will, one of the most brilliant Jewish theologians of the day, Gamaliel. So he is educated under Gamaliel, so he gains the Eastern way of thinking. So now he is the missionary, God's missionary to take the Jewish gospel about the Jewish Messiah to the world that is a Greek culture. So God is at work in an overly ambitious 20-year-old who possibly even assassinated his father to prepare the way for the gospel to go to the ends of the earth.